Are you truly the master of your own mind, or are you just a mosaic of habits laid brick by unconscious brick? William James, the father of American psychology, insisted that we are what we repeatedly do not by nature, but by nurture, sculpted hour by hour through our acts. In this video, we plunge into the visceral world of habits, not as banal routines, but as the invisible architecture of our soul's continuity. Imagine waking up tomorrow with no memory of your behaviors, no grooves carved by repetition, no reflexes of the self. Would you still be you? Attention, interest, desire, and action. James's pragmatic theory of the mind hinges on this cascading sequence. Habits, to him, are the mechanism that welds thought to reality, making the ideal actual. They're not mere tools. They are your being in motion. We will dissect James's radical notion that habit is both our liberation and our prison. From the soldier who fires before he thinks, to the monk whose serenity is trained like a muscle, habit becomes a paradox, freeing us to think by automating action, yet threatening to make us automata if unchecked. You'll never look at brushing your teeth, responding to a text, or choosing silence the same way again. Ready to challenge what you think you know about your mind? Let James guide us through a terrain where science meets introspection and where freedom is not in spontaneity, but in the right conditioning. The morning fog curls through the empty streets, a metaphor for the mind just waking unshaped, unclaimed, suspended between chaos and order. In William James's philosophy, this moment of transition is sacred. It is here, before the day takes its form, that habit begins its silent labor. Not with grand declarations, but with the brushing of teeth, the reaching for a cup, the sequencing of laces tied in a pattern older than memory. These acts are not trivial, they are foundational. They are the syntax of the self. For James, the psychological universe begins not in theory, but in pulse rhythms of action repeated until they cease to be noticed, until they vanish into the bloodstream of our identity. He tells us that habit is the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious conservative agent. It preserves what works and discards what doesn't, but its conservatism is not ideological, it is biological, mechanical, psychic. Habit encodes what survives in us. We see it in the trembling hand of a surgeon, calm not because she wills it, but because years of repetition have made her body wise. We see it in the recovering alcoholic who walks past a bar with a practiced indifference that cost him years to earn. We see it in ourselves, in the way our feet find their place on the floor every morning, as if directed by an invisible conductor. This is James's point. Habit is not about what we do, but about what we become through what we do. His view of the mind is not that of a blank slate, but of a soft wax, warmed by experience, shaped by every groove of practice. He writes, plasticity, then, in the wide sense of the word, means the possession of a structure weak enough to yield to an influence, but strong enough not to yield all at once. Plasticity is possibility, but habit is its cost. To form a habit is to fossilize plasticity, to let one path dominate others, to engrave one option and leave 1,000 unwalked. James does not lament this. He reveres it. Without habit, he says, life would be unbearable. If we had to consider in every action the law of gravity, the friction of the floor, the texture of the air, we would never rise from bed. Habit allows us to ascend to consciousness, to choice, to freedom, precisely because it handles the groundwork. It is the automation that makes reflection possible, yet this same mechanism can become a trap. When the flywheel spins without review, when it governs even our highest ideals, habit morphs into destiny. James warns that a chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and life is after all a chain. Every neglected moment of inattention, every unreflective gesture adds another weak link to the chain of our being. And so, he implores, pay attention to your beginnings. The first time you act, you choose the future shape of your soul. Consider the soldier in combat. He does not deliberate before he ducks. His training, the layering of rehearsed responses, makes him act faster than thought. James praises this, not as mindlessness, but as mastery. The body becomes an ally of the will when it no longer resists its commands. But the same mechanism that serves the soldier can enslave the addict. Repetition engraves both vice and virtue with equal indifference. The flywheel has no morality, only momentum. It is here that James's pragmatism blooms. He is not concerned with whether an act is free in the metaphysical sense. He wants to know what it does. What difference does it make in the stream of your life? For James, the self is a process, a series of choices hardened into grooves. My experience is what I agree to attend to, he writes. And what I attend to, I reinforce. Attention is the chisel. Habit is the sculpture. In the classroom, in the street, in the silence of midnight self-confrontation, James insists that the secret to transformation lies in repetition with purpose. It is not enough to dream or wish or intend. One must do and do again. Seize the very first possible opportunity to act on every resolution you make, he says. Delay is decay. Resolution without execution is the cemetery of the soul. He draws from the example of muscle memory. Just as the violinist's fingers move by grace of relentless practice, so too does the ethical life depend on habituated goodness. You do not become generous by waiting to feel generous. You give until giving becomes your reflex. You do not become brave by waiting for fear to vanish. You act bravely, trembling, until courage replaces hesitation. And so, he lays out a code, almost ascetic. In its demand, never suffer an exception. The one time you skip the gym, the one lie you let slide, the one indulgence you excuse, these are not moments. They are precedents. They are the inflection points of your identity. Every act diminishes or enhances your character, James argues. The self is under construction, always, and habit is the blueprint. There is a quiet terror in this view, but also a profound hope. For James, it means you are never trapped. No matter how fixed your patterns seem, plasticity remains. If you can act, you can rewire. If you can notice, you can redirect. The transformation of character is not a lightning bolt. It is the slow, deliberate reorientation of behavior. The hero is not the one who leaps once, but the one who walks the new path until it becomes the old one. He tells us to begin in small things, but to begin. Rise when the alarm sounds. Speak when truth demands. Apologize before pride wins. Over time, these micro-acts weld into macro being. You become what you do. Not instantly, not without resistance, but inevitably. And yet James does not reduce us to machines. He leaves space for the will. In moments of crisis, in the trembling heat of decision, we can by an act of will override the mechanism. We can choose anew. He calls this the effort of attention, the moment where we override ease in favor of meaning. It is hard. It is rare, but it is real. It is the fulcrum of freedom. As we live longer in a world of distractions and automated algorithms, James's vision feels prophetic. Who are you when your habits are coded by corporations, your preferences shaped by swipes, your reflexes trained by endless feeds? He does not preach resistance for its own sake. He asks, does your life reflect your deepest values? If not, your habits are your jailers. But if yes, if your daily motions echo your highest convictions, then habit is your ally. It is the scaffolding of your soul. It is the vessel of your freedom. It is the quiet proof that transformation is not only possible, but inescapable. Before you leave this video, pause. Not to reflect abstractly, but to act concretely. Choose one small thing, change it, repeat it again, and then again. Let habit become your revolution. And if this exploration stirs something in you, if James's voice, through mine, has struck a nerve, consider subscribing. This is only the beginning. In the dim light of a late afternoon study, books casting long shadows across the wood grain of a silent desk, William James leans into a question that has haunted minds for centuries. Can a person truly change? Not in bursts of epiphany, not in the heat of crisis, but in the slow, ordinary unfolding of days. To this he answers not with sermons or slogans, but with a surgeon's precision and a mystic's fire. Yes, if they understand the mechanics of habit and the fluid boundary between will and repetition. At the center of James's psychology is the conviction that consciousness is not a static container, but a stream. Thoughts flow, merge, diverge, collide. Nothing is held forever. Everything is in transit. But within this river, some currents deepen, dig into the soil of the mind, becoming habits, not because they are natural, but because they are rehearsed. And here lies the power. What is rehearsed can be revised. James insists that character is not a finished sculpture but a clay form, malleable by practice and decision. He sees the human mind not as a throne of reason, but as a battlefield of tendencies, where each action strengthens a particular army of possibility. The great thing, then, he writes, in all education, is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. This is not metaphor. It is instruction. Your nervous system, once your captor in trauma and reaction, can become your companion if you train it with care. He draws this insight from his clinical observations and from life itself. Think of the piano student whose first weeks are agony, fingers stiff, notes jarring, but through repetition, the pain becomes poise. The nervous system, resistant at first, yields. It becomes pliant. The body obeys what the mind could only imagine. This, for James, is the miracle of habit, that the mechanical becomes magical, that the dull becomes divine. Yet he cautions, there is no neutral habit. Every repetition is an investment. We are spinning our own fates, he writes, good or evil, and never to be undone. Each choice lays a stone on the path we will soon call inevitable. The man who skips one act of kindness, the woman who suppresses one act of courage, these are not lost moments. They are the beginnings of alternative selves, selves we did not become because we failed to choose them often enough. There is a kind of moral ecology in James's view. Habits do not exist in isolation. They form systems. One indulgence begets another. One discipline strengthens the spine of others. The man who learns to rise early often finds himself more punctual, more focused, more at peace. Not because of the clock, but because rising early was a signal to his whole being. We are not slaves to whim. We choose our way. James also penetrates the relationship between habit and belief. In a world where rationalists demanded proof before faith, he reversed the logic. Believe that life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact. In other words, act as if. Live the habit of hope before hope is justified. In doing so, you give it ground to grow. This is no empty optimism. It is existential craftsmanship. You don't wait to feel brave to act bravely. You act, and in acting, you become. This becomes especially urgent in moments of crisis. When life fractures, when a loved one dies, when failure arrives, when the scaffolding of identity collapses, it is not theory that saves us. It is habit. James writes movingly about the need for emergency drills of the soul. We must rehearse our responses to tragedy in advance, through reflection, prayer, silence, or service. so that when the blow comes, we do not shatter. The habit of inner attention becomes a fortress or a sanctuary. Consider grief. The man who has made it his habit to write, to walk, to meditate, not out of inspiration, but out of rhythm, finds in sorrow a path that does not destroy him. His nervous system, trained in attention, does not flinch at pain. It holds it. It integrates it. The grief does not become less real, but it becomes survivable. This is not to say that habit alone redeems. James warns against the opposite danger: automatism. The man who lives by routine alone, without scrutiny, becomes a machine. He functions, but does not flourish. The soul, for James, requires surprise. Habit must serve freedom, not eclipse it. There must be a center of will that remains alert, capable of questioning the very habits it relies on. Here lies the paradox. Habit is essential for freedom, but only if the will periodically breaks its own patterns. This is what James means when he writes about the moral holiday. The saint, he says, must not become rigid. There must be moments of disobedience, of questioning, of friction, lest virtue become tyranny. Freedom is not a lack of structure, it is the power to remake structure. Again and again, in the theater of the soul, James gives us two characters: the impulsive actor, moved by every wind of mood, and the habitual actor, moved by the grooves of previous acts. Both are flawed. Both are incomplete. What he seeks is the third figure, the one who chooses their habits with intention, lives them with attention, and interrupts them with discernment. This is the ethical artist. And so, in our ordinary lives, he calls us to this artistry. To brush our teeth not just as routine, but as a small assertion of order. To respond to anger not by reflex, but by rehearsed calm. To choose, even when no one sees, the slightly harder, slightly better path. And to do it again, and again, and again. Over time, James tells us, this repetition rewires the soul. The man who once envied becomes the man who celebrates. The woman who once feared becomes the woman who stands. Not because they were reborn in a single moment, but because each day they chose their future in micro acts of will. This is the revolution of habit. It does not storm the gates. It sands them down. It doesn't shout. It whispers, but its echo is eternal. A boy sits on the edge of a dock, watching the lake absorb the sky. The stillness is not empty, it is alive, pulsing with unseen movements, like the mind beneath its surface. William James would call this the fringe of consciousness, the periphery where feelings, tendencies, and thoughts have formed weight to crystallize into clarity. It is in these liminal spaces that habits are born, not as commands, but as nudges. Not as laws, but as leanings. For James, the mind is not a hierarchy of reason over instinct, but a field of forces. Attention is the beam that moves across this field, selecting what will rise into awareness, what will be enacted, and what will be lost. And habit? Habit is the magnetic pattern beneath the field, shaping what comes to the surface again and again. To understand this is to understand that we are never truly free until we understand what selects our thoughts for us. This is where James diverges from the idealists and the determinists alike. He does not believe we are purely rational, nor that we are cogs in a cosmic machine. He proposes something bolder. We are navigators within a chaos of impressions, steering not by pure logic, but by practiced motion. Our freedom lies not in escaping pattern, but in choosing which patterns to reinforce. He tells us that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. This is not a talent, but a habit, a cultivated capacity. In the age of endless distraction, this becomes our most urgent discipline. not to force the mind into stillness, but to return it, gently and repeatedly, to what matters. Consider prayer not as theology, but as habit. To James, the prayerful mind is a trained mind. It has practiced the return. It has made sacred the act of reattention. Whether one prays to God, to reason, or to the future self, the act is the same. You interrupt the torrent of noise and choose, again and again, what to hold. This is not superstition. It is soul-gymnastics. The same applies to study. The student who builds a habit of deep reading does not simply absorb information. He learns how to bear the weight of sustained thought. He learns how to live in tension with not knowing. He becomes more than informed, he becomes formed. His nervous system learns the posture of inquiry, and inquiry becomes his temperament. In this way, James's psychology becomes a spiritual practice. It invites us to view every repeated act as either a degradation or an elevation of our being. Each habit is a rite, a liturgy of the self. The way we enter a room, greet a stranger, close a door, these are not trivial. They are expressions of who we are training ourselves to become. And so, he issues a silent manifesto: live deliberately. Let each habit be a consecration. He does not ask for grand vows or ascetic heroics. He asks that we pay attention to the groove being carved with every motion. The man who slouches in thoughtless despair trains himself to slouch in spirit. The woman who thanks her barista every morning without fail is not just polite, she is practicing reverence. James speaks of second nature, the self we become after we rehearsed our first instincts into new instincts. This second nature is not artificial, it is earned. And in earning it, we become more ourselves. We are not fated to be creatures of impulse, but neither can we transcend without labor. The soul, like the body, strengthens through resistance. Imagine the act of forgiveness. For many, it seems impossible. But for James, forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a habit to be formed. The first time, it hurts. The second time, it still hurts. But by the 10th, the neural paths have begun to clear. The resistance weakens. The soul has rehearsed release. And one day, it becomes natural. Not because the injury was small, but because the person became large. The same is true of patience, of honesty, of listening. These are not traits. They are trained capacities. The man who listens without interrupting has trained his attention to resist the urge of self-insertion. The woman who tells the truth even when it hurts has trained her tongue not to flinch at consequences. These are spiritual calluses. And like all calluses, they are earned through friction. James is not naive about the difficulty. He acknowledges the force of inertia, the power of old habits to resist the new. But he insists that this resistance is not absolute. Plasticity remains. The nervous system, no matter how hardened, retains some capacity to bend. The older we get, the harder it becomes, but the principle holds. If we can act, we can change. This, to James, is the core of human dignity. We are not merely reactors. We are reformers of ourselves and, by extension, of the world. The man who builds the habit of generosity changes more than his own reflexes. He becomes a note of change in the social field. His kindness interrupts cycles of aggression. His steadiness becomes a mirror for others. Habit becomes contagion. Virtue becomes viral. And yet, there is danger in this power. The same mechanisms that build saints build ideologues. Repetition without reflection becomes fanaticism. James warns against the habit of certainty. He urges the will to believe, not as dogma, but as openness. We must train ourselves to hold convictions lightly, to revise our positions, to remain porous. This too is a habit, the habit of epistemic humility. In the end, James does not give us a map. He gives us a compass. He says, notice your habits. Interrogate them. Honor the good ones. Replace the corrosive ones. And above all, never believe that you are finished. The soul is not a statue. It is a symphony in rehearsal. So let us rehearse. Let us build, breath by breath, a second nature worthy of our first. 1. Let us be artisans of attention, architects of repetition. And let us remember, the most ordinary act, repeated with care, becomes sacred. The clock ticks in a room where no one speaks, but where 1,000 decisions are made without words. This is the scene of inner life, the theater where most of our revolutions happen quietly. William James knew that silence was not emptiness, it was the space where habits germinate, where the soil of the self is either tilled or neglected. The true drama of character unfolds not in speeches, but in subtle repetitions, where what we do when no one is watching determines who we are becoming. James was relentless in his conviction that human beings are not prisoners of impulse. Rather, we are apprentices of possibility. In his view, even our most unthinking actions are built on layers of choice, layers we can peel back, examine, and if we dare, reshape. He challenges us to stop living by default and to begin living by design. He writes that the greatest enemy of moral progress is not evil, but slothful automatism, the inertia of doing what we've always done simply because we've always done it. This inertia, masked as comfort, is the slow death of the soul. James insists that the first step toward freedom is to recognize that even our so-called natural tendencies were once formed. If they were formed, they can be reformed. The chains are self-forged and thus self-breakable. Take, for instance, the act of speaking up in a group. For some, silence feels natural. For others, speech is second nature. But James would ask, how did it become so? What repetitions of encouragement or ridicule, of reward or shame trained the nervous system to either hold the tongue or let it loose? The answer lies in biography, but the future lies in practice. He was fascinated by what he called the recoil. This is the moment after an action where we feel either remorse or reinforcement. It is the soul's feedback loop. A child who lies and is not caught, but feels a pang of discomfort, is being offered a window of plasticity. If that pang is heeded, a new habit may be formed. If it is ignored, the reflex to deceive becomes just that, a reflex. James urges us to seize these moments, these windows of moral elasticity. Act the part, he says, and you will become the part. This is not hypocrisy. It is habit building. Pretend to be kind, and if you persist, the performance becomes reality. The nerves, once resistant, yield. The soul, once doubtful, consents. We become the echo of our own consistency. This idea has radical implications. It means that no one is ever too far gone. It also means that sainthood is not a gift, it is a grind. The patient father, the honest journalist, the compassionate nurse, none of these roles are performed out of divine talent. They are forged in repetition. One breath, one sentence, one action at a time. This view democratizes virtue. It tells us that character is not inherited but earned. And it warns us that vice is not fate but laziness. If we fail to train our better selves, the worse self wins by default. There is no standing still in our moral being, James writes. We are either going up or down. The staircase is habit. The direction is choice. What then of willpower? James does not dismiss it, but he relocates it. Will is not a dramatic thunderbolt, it is the quiet recommitment to a chosen pattern. Will shows itself in the decision to rise from bed when despair clutches the chest, in the refusal to return a harsh word. in the commitment to meditate for 5 minutes, again and again and again, even when it feels useless. These are the true proofs of freedom. He believed that effort of attention is the root of all will. The man who can sustain focus on what is hard, what is necessary, is the man who governs himself. The world may offer temptations, but if attention has been trained by years of mental practice, it will hold fast. The wind will blow, but the anchor holds. This is not about strength. It is about conditioning. This is why James often sounds like a moral trainer. He does not preach goodness as abstract principle. He prescribes exercises. Start small, he says. Choose a task. Repeat it. Resist the exception. Build the groove. Etch the path. Let your nerves remember what you want to forget. Let your body become the servant of your ideals. And when you fail, as you will, he insists you fail forward. Do not lament. Do not spiral. Return to the act. Start again. There is always plasticity left. The soul, unlike bone, is never beyond resetting. But you must act. Reflection without action is a lie. Intention without execution is moral opium. The only truth of character is what you do consistently. James gives us a vivid metaphor. He imagines a man in a trench, resolving to be brave. The bullets fly and the man wants to flee. But if he stays just once, he begins to teach his nerves that flight is not the only option. If he stays again, the nerves learn faster. By the 10th time, he no longer decides, he simply acts. He has become brave, not by nature, but by nurture. This, James says, is the essence of transformation. In this light, even suffering becomes a school. The man who meets grief with silence instead of bitterness, who turns his sorrow into deeper listening, is building a habit of grace. The woman who endures rejection without self-loathing, who returns to the work, to the words, to the love, she is carving a groove of resilience. These are not accidents. They are achievements. But this achievement is threatened daily. The modern world, James might say, is an engine of dishabituation. Notifications, ads, political rage, commercial overstimulation, all of it works against the formation of strong, internal habits. We live in a theater of reaction, not reflection. And so the work of habit building is now more radical than ever. It is the reclamation of selfhood in a world that profits from your fragmentation. To resist is not to withdraw. It is to practice. To carve out time for ritual. To protect solitude. To walk instead of scroll. To call instead of comment. To write instead of swipe. These are habits. They are not random. They are revolutionary. And you, what are the habits you've allowed to form without consent? What patterns are writing your biography without your authorship? James would not shame you. He would only ask, will you begin again? The rain hits the pavement like a memory repeating itself, soft, insistent, rhythmic. Somewhere a man walks home from work. He takes the same street, nods to the same neighbor, keys the same lock. None of it feels profound, but William James would argue otherwise. To him, this man is not just commuting. He is cultivating. The ordinary, repeated act is never just what it appears to be. It is an investment. A rehearsal. A rehearsal for what the soul becomes when the extraordinary arrives. James built his philosophy not on abstract ideals, but on lived texture, the raw kinetic experience of being human. He knew that we are not born with ready-made identities. We acquire them through the ceaseless laying down of tracks in the nervous system. And we do so in precisely these moments: walking, nodding, keying. What is done often becomes what we are. In his masterwork, The Principles of Psychology, James delves into the mechanics of this process. Habit, he says, is the organic equivalent of artificial intelligence. It allows us to perform complex sequences without conscious thought. But more than that, it allows us to reserve our conscious attention for what truly demands it: moral dilemmas, existential questions, creative acts. Without habit, our minds would be paralyzed by the trivial. With it, we can transcend the trivial through preparation. But here lies the danger. If we do not choose our habits deliberately, they choose us blindly. The groove carved by accident becomes the path of least resistance. And resistance, in James's moral universe, is sacred. It is through resisting the pull of ease, of comfort, of thoughtless repetition that we reclaim the self as an agent, not just a bundle of reactions, but a being who initiates. He speaks often of the effort of will, not the grand, dramatic gesture, but the quiet muscle that turns the wheel of habit just one more time in the right direction. Imagine a woman who decides to write every morning at 6 a.m. The first day, she struggles. The second, she curses. But by the 10th, the resistance has weakened. By the 30th, she no longer asks herself whether to rise, she simply does. Her fingers know the way. Her mind has been shaped by her decision. This shaping is both neurological and existential. James was one of the first to argue that the brain's pathways are not fixed, but plastic. Modern neuroscience confirms what he intuited. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Behavior repeated becomes structure, and structure shapes perception. She doesn't just write because she's disciplined. She's become someone who sees the world through the eyes of one who writes. This is the real miracle of habit. It doesn't just change what we do, it changes what we notice. The man who has made it a habit to listen deeply begins to hear tones in people's voices that others miss. The woman who has trained herself to pause before responding finds silence more informative than speech. These are not superpowers. They are practiced sensitivities, and they are available to anyone. But James does not romanticize this power. He warns of its neutrality. Habit will reinforce whatever it is fed. If we repeatedly respond to stress with avoidance, to disagreement with contempt, to boredom with distraction, those responses will become our nature. We will not even know we're choosing them. They will feel like instinct. And instinct, unexamined, becomes destiny. He challenges us to take responsibility for these reflexes, not to blame ourselves, but to intervene. 2. Ask in the quiet spaces between actions, is this who I want to become? Is this the reflex I want to build into the architecture of my being? If the answer is no, then begin again. Choose differently. Repeat. There is no shortcut. But there is always a next step. James's vision of the self is profoundly hopeful. He believed in the capacity for radical transformation not as fantasy, but as neuroethical engineering. You become generous by giving when it's inconvenient. You become patient by waiting when it's painful. You become courageous by acting when you are afraid. Each of these, practiced, becomes easier. Not because the world changes, because you do doubt, and this is not merely psychological. It is spiritual. James often blurred the line between the two. For him, habit is a moral tool. It allows us to embody ideals long before they feel natural. You do not wait to feel virtuous to act virtuously. You act, and in acting, you give your better angels a chance to take root. But this root system requires vigilance. He warns that the soil of habit can also breed weeds. Cynicism, for example, often begins as protection, becomes pattern, and ends as personality. Sarcasm, practiced often enough, calcifies into worldview. He saw this in academia, in politics, in religion. The man who once doubted as a tool becomes a man who believes in nothing, not because he chose nihilism, but because he rehearsed it. And so the question becomes, what do you rehearse when no one is watching? What grooves are you deepening in your nervous system with every small act, every repeated gesture? James insists, there are no neutral habits. Everyone tilts you toward a version of yourself, and to some of those tilts is the story you end up telling. He also recognized the role of environment. We are not solitary habit formers, we are embedded in social ecologies. Our patterns are influenced by those around us. He advised shaping one's surroundings to support the self you aim to become. Keep the books within reach. Eliminate the cues that trigger relapse. Surround yourself with those whose habits inspire, not corrode. Habit is contagious. Choose your vectors wisely. This view empowers but also humbles. It reminds us that we are always in process, always susceptible, always capable of both regression and renewal. There is no arrival. There is only deepening. James's psychology is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming aligned. Aligned with your values, your vision, your highest possibility. And when the alignment falters, as it will, return to the act. Not to the feeling, not to the ideal, but to the concrete, repeatable act. Lay out your clothes. Light the candle. Write the sentence. Call the friend. These are not small things. They are the architecture of redemption. At the end of this long meditation on habit, James leaves us not with commandments but with an invitation. He says, in essence, live as if your smallest action matters, because it does. Every breath, every glance, every choice is a vote for the person you wish to be. And with enough votes, identity changes. The soul reforms. The world bends. The morning sun creeps across the floor of a quiet room where someone sits, unmoving, eyes closed, not in sleep, but in practice. This is not meditation in the spiritual sense, not exactly. It is the exercise of returning attention, again and again, to a single point. William James would have called it a training ground for the will. In this seemingly uneventful ritual, the individual rehearses one of the most vital skills of human life, the redirection of consciousness. For James, attention is the fountainhead from which all other mental life flows. Thought, emotion, belief, all are shaped, guided, or starved by the focus of the mind. And this focus, like a muscle, can be cultivated or neglected. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again, he writes, is the very root of judgment, character, and will. The implications are staggering. To direct attention is not just to think better, but to become better. This power of attention is where habit meets heroism. For James, habit is not just the automation of behavior, it is the preparation of the soul for decisive moments. Life is not a continuous string of emergencies. Most of it is repetition. But in the rare moments when the stakes rise, it is not our intentions that guide us, but our habits. And the root of all habits is attention, what we notice, what we ignore, what we let shape us through repetition. In this sense, attention becomes a moral act. What we choose to focus on becomes a declaration of value. The person who cultivates a habit of gratitude does not merely notice the good. They train their nervous system to dwell on it, to elevate it, to let it anchor the rest of their experience. This anchoring reshapes their emotional palette. They suffer, as all do, but their suffering finds itself braided with remembrance. They do not drown as easily. James saw attention as the scaffolding of belief. What we believe is not a cold computation, but a hot loyalty, what we have chosen, again and again, to take seriously. If you attend often to failure, you will likely believe in futility. If you attend to generosity, even in small doses, you will start to believe in goodness. The mind constructs its reality from the materials attention provides. This gives birth to a powerful kind of agency. You are not helpless before your feelings. You are not imprisoned by your moods. You can choose where to look. You can choose what to repeat. And in this repetition, you are rewiring not just your thoughts, but your essence. But this power is not automatic. It must be fought for. James describes will not as brute force, but as the effort of attention, the act of holding focus. When distraction beckons, of returning to the meaningful when the trivial sings its siren song. This effort is tiring. It demands energy. And it cannot be sustained indefinitely, but it can be trained. And when it is, it becomes second nature. Second nature is James's term for the self forged by habit. The individual who once had to strain. To wake early, to resist envy, to tell the truth, eventually becomes someone who does so naturally. Not because the task is easier, but because the nervous system has learned the pattern. Will has become instinct. Freedom has become reflex. This is the paradox of James's vision. True spontaneity is not the opposite of habit, but its result. The jazz musician improvises freely because she has practiced the scales 1,000 times. The firefighter moves with instinctual wisdom because he has trained for years. The saint forgives reflexively because she has rehearsed compassion again and again. What looks effortless is the product of deliberate repetition. And yet, James never loses sight of danger. He knows that the same mechanism that creates excellence can also create cruelty. The soldier trained to obey may commit atrocities without question. The cynic trained to sneer may lose the capacity to hope. Habit, left unexamined, becomes ideology. It becomes blindness. And so James calls us to remain vigilant, to direct attention not just outward, but inward. What are my habits doing to me? What are they preparing me for? He insists that every day is a kind of rehearsal, not for a role imposed from without, but for a character authored from within. The self is not found, it is formed. Not all at once, but moment by moment, act by act. The small decisions shape the grand destiny. This is the ethical drama of life, not whether we will be tested, but whether we are training. This drama is most visible in crisis. The person who has cultivated a habit of calm is not unfeeling, they are prepared. The person who has built a habit of honesty does not need to deliberate, they speak. These are not miracles. They are the fruits of 100,000 invisible choices. And when the crisis comes, they do not rise to the occasion, they fall back on their training. This is James's secret. You prepare for the future by how you live today. Not in abstractions, but in rituals. The ritual of pausing before you speak. The ritual of gratitude before sleep. The ritual of walking without your phone. These are not quaint practices. They are the scaffolding of the self you are becoming. And, in a world that competes daily for your attention, these rituals are acts of rebellion. To meditate for 10 minutes is to resist the economy of noise. To write in a journal is to reclaim your narrative. To speak with intentionality is to subvert the culture of reaction. Habit becomes activism. Personal growth becomes political defiance. But none of this happens in a flash. James is clear. Transformation is cumulative. You do not wake up free. You practice freedom. You do not feel peaceful by chance. You cultivate peace. Each act lays a stone. Each choice deepens the groove. Each repetition strengthens the signal. And here we return to the soul in silence. The person who sits in the morning light, returning the attention to breath, to body, to being, they are not wasting time. They are forging the mental muscles that will carry them through storm and sorrow. They are practicing presence. And presence, to James, is the precursor to everything worthwhile. So ask yourself, what are you practicing today? What kind of soul are you rehearsing in your ordinary moments? Not who do you want to be, but what do your habits say you are becoming? A child learns to tie their shoes, not by philosophy, not by theory, but by the slow, clumsy repetition of fingers, and loops. Day by day, the motions become smoother, the memory more embodied, until one day, the act is done. Without thought. William James saw in this simple process the blueprint for all higher development. For him, tying a shoe and forging a soul are not so different. Both are acts of practice. Both are victories of habit. James believed that the mind is not a pre-written script but a living theater, constantly improvising, constantly repeating, constantly revising. Each scene leaves a residue. Each repetition engraves a gesture, and over time, those gestures form character. Not in the abstract, but in the concrete. How we respond to delay, how we speak when angry, how we act when tired. These are the true tests of what kind of self we are becoming. He rejected the Cartesian image of the mind as a detached observer. For James, the mind is a worker. It labors, it toils, it engages. And its greatest tools are habits refined through attention, solidified through action. We become what we do, he insisted, and we are always doing something. This always doing is not a cause for anxiety, it is an invitation to creativity. The painter lays brush to canvas. The pianist touches key after key. And the ordinary human soul, each day, makes contact with habit. The stroke may be small, the note may be brief, but over time, the composition becomes undeniable. You are making something of yourself. Right now. Always. James speaks of this with urgency, not despair. The fact that we are always changing means we are never finished. There is always hope, but there is also always responsibility. The grooves we dig in youth will hold us in age. The patterns we tolerate now will become the limitations we cannot escape later. This is why he was so insistent on early formation. The more of the details of our daily life we can hand over to the effortless custody of automatism, the more our higher powers of mind will be set free for their own proper work. This is not a call to become robotic, it is a strategy. Train the hand to write smoothly so the mind can think freely. Train the body to move gracefully so the will can aim higher. This applies not only to physical habits, but to moral ones. The person who trains themselves to pause before judging, to assume good intentions, to offer the benefit of the doubt, this person is creating a moral reflex. One that, over time, will shape not just their behavior, but their perception. They will begin to see differently, to feel differently. Their nervous system will learn to trust goodness before suspicion. James warns, however, that this training must be conscious. The world will not train you for virtue. It will train you for efficiency, for reaction, for compliance. If you want to be free, you must train yourself to resist. This is why he valued the cultivation of attention so highly. The ability to return to what matters, to what is right, to what is true, is not natural. It is earned, and it is earned through repetition. Not occasional but consistent. The man who is kind once a week remains uncertain. The man who is kind every day becomes kind. Not in name, but in nerve. The kindness lives in his gestures, in his tone, in his silence. It is not a mask, it is a groove. But what a failure! James is unsparing, yet compassionate. He does not believe in flawless transformation. He believes in persistent recommitment. No matter how often we fall, he implies, we can rise again if we choose the act. It is not belief that saves us, but behavior. Not thought, but repetition. Not resolve, but rhythm. Failure, then, is not falling short. It is ceasing to try. The man who relapses, who lies, who lashes out, he is not condemned if he returns to the act of change. The habit of beginning again is perhaps the highest habit of all. It is the habit of hope. James's world is not a static cosmos, but a living system of forces. Every act sends ripples. Every repetition strengthens some pattern. We are not isolated selves, but nodes in a shared nervous system. The man who becomes more honest lifts the moral gravity of those around him. The woman who models courage in quiet ways gives permission for others to stand. We affect each other not just by words, but by the consistency of our being. This is why James called habit the great conservative principle of nature. It preserves what works. It resists chaos. But he also saw it as the vehicle for progress. Not progress imposed from without, but growth chosen from within. Each of us, he believed, is a laboratory. And each day is an experiment in being. So how do we run this experiment? Well, by choosing rituals that embody our values, by shaping our spaces to support our aims, by noticing when we are being shaped unconsciously and reclaiming that power. The one who walks each day in silence, who returns to the same poem, who likes the same candle, this person is not merely sentimental. They are forming a self that can hold steady when the storm comes. James understood, above all, that the storm will come: grief, loss, injustice, temptation. These are not rare, they are inevitable. And when they come, the mind will not have time to deliberate. It will fall back on what has been rehearsed. The act of forgiveness, the refusal to hate, the breath before the word, these must already be in the body, in the nerves, in the soul. This is the wisdom of habit. And this wisdom is available to all, not to the gifted, but to the persistent. Not to the enlightened, but to the engaged. James levels the field. He tells us that greatness is not a leap, it is a groove. And each of us holds the chisel. So what habits are you carving into the bedrock of your being? Are they aligned with who you wish to be or who you have carelessly become? A crowd watches a high wire act, breath held, hearts caught between awe and fear. The performer steps carefully, slowly, across the void. What they see is balance, but William James would have seen something else: habit in action, reflexes rehearsed to the point of unconscious grace. The rope may wobble, the wind may rise, but the performer's body does not panic. It remembers. It remembers what it has done thousands of times. This, James would say, is the mind embodied. This is freedom earned through repetition. James knew that most people imagine freedom as the absence of constraints, the ability to do whatever one wishes. But he proposed something subtler and far more powerful. Real freedom, he argued, is the ability to act rightly without having to deliberate at every turn. It is to have trained the self so well that virtue is no longer a choice, but a rhythm. This is not less free. It is more free, because it means that even in crisis, when the lights go out and the system is stressed, the self does not betray itself. This is the purpose of habit: not to confine, but to liberate. Not to suppress the will, but to scaffold it. Habit frees us to be more present, more focused, more daring in the moments that matter most. It is what allows the nurse to act quickly in emergency, the artist to dive deeply into inspiration, the parent to comfort without hesitation. These are not accidents of temperament. They are achievements of practice. James saw this principle at work in every domain: ethical, intellectual, physical, emotional. The philosopher who returns to difficult texts is shaping a habit of intellectual humility. The friend who checks in weekly, even when tired, is shaping a habit of constancy. The man who notices his anger and breathes instead of lashing out is shaping a habit of self-command. These are not gifts. They are cultivated responses. They are the result of 1,000 tiny efforts, often unseen, often unpraised. This brings James to one of his most challenging claims. You are responsible for your second nature. Your first nature may be given your genetics, your upbringing, your instincts. But your second nature, the self you train, the self you shape through ritual and routine that is yours to construct. And in constructing it, you are not only defining your future, you are preparing your legacy. He tells us that there is no action so small that it is without consequence. Every choice strengthens or weakens a pattern. Every moment of indulgence or discipline bends the arc of character. And over time, the arc hardens. What begins as possibility becomes personality. What begins as behavior becomes identity. You become what you repeatedly do not just in body, but in spirit. And this becoming is never isolated. James insists that the self is always in relation. Your habits shape how others experience you. The colleague who arrives on time, the teacher who listens, the stranger who smiles, these are more than personal virtues. They are social currents. They shape the emotional climate of a room, a home, a community. The impact of habit radiates. But what happens when the habit is destructive? What of the man who, after years of sarcasm, finds he can no longer speak sincerely? Or the woman who, after years of control, can no longer trust? James does not sugarcoat this. Habits can damage. They can ossify. They can become prisons. But he also insists, no prison is inescapable. There is always a crack. There is always a moment to act differently. The question is whether we are willing to endure the awkwardness of change, because change at first is awkward. The nervous system resists. The mind balks. The body forgets. James calls this the resistance of the old path. It is the echo of comfort, the ghost of past rhythms. But if one can persist, if one can walk the new path a second time, a third, a 10th, the resistance weakens. The new becomes possible, then probable, then inevitable. And yet, James never reduces this process to willpower alone. He recognizes the importance of structure, of cues, of community. He advises designing your environment to support your best habits. Put the book by your bed. Leave the phone in another room. Set the appointment. Join the group. Make the promise. These are not crutches. They are tools. Tools to help the will get traction. For James, habit is not an enemy of authenticity. It is its ally. The person who has practiced honesty, patience, humility over time, these qualities are no longer effortful. They are not performances. They are real. They are the default. And this default becomes what others trust, what communities rely on, what society builds upon. Civilizations are not made by ideals. They are made by habits. And this brings us to the core of James's moral vision. You are what you train, not what you dream, not what you promise, but what you do repeatedly. The man who wants to be courageous must face fear daily. The woman who wants to be kind must act kindly when it's inconvenient. The self is a sculpture and repetition is the chisel. There is no shortcut, but there is always a step. James does not ask for perfection. He asks for practice, for the willingness to fail, to begin again, to recommit to the better groove. This, for him, is the true heroism, not the grand gesture, but the daily fidelity to a higher possibility. And so we return to the high wire artist. Each step is practiced, each gesture refined. And when they wobble, they do not panic. They reset, they adjust. They trust the training. This is not luck, it is design. It is devotion. So too, in our lives, the step toward truth, the step toward forgiveness, the step toward discipline. Each one a rehearsal for the next. Each one a vote for the self we want to become. Each one, in time, becoming who we are. There is a moment each evening when the world softens. The light fades, the noise dims, and the self becomes more audible. In this twilight, William James imagined a different kind of attention, a retrospective. Gaze not frantic, not analytical, but honest. A gaze that looks back on the day not to judge, but to understand. What did I repeat today? What grooves did I deepen? And where, if anywhere, did I begin to change? James's entire philosophy could be summed up in one imperative: do not sleepwalk through your life. He begged his readers to awaken to the significance of their patterns, to the sacred power of repetition. Because to him, habit was not just psychological, it was ontological. It determined what kind of being you were becoming, not just in terms of behavior, but in terms of what you are capable of perceiving, believing, giving, enduring. He believed that consciousness, left untrained, would always take the path of least resistance. That's why he called attention the essential moral act. To choose what to focus on is to choose what matters. And to choose what matters repeatedly is to build a life that reflects your values rather than your distractions. But he also knew that attention alone was not enough. There had to be effort. There had to be action. There had to be the courage to persist when no one applauded, when no one noticed, when the old self screamed in protest. For James, this was the essence of spiritual discipline. The quiet heroism of doing the right thing often enough that it becomes part of you. And when it becomes part of you, you change the terms of your own existence. The person who practices love begins to see the lovable in others. The person who practices courage begins to feel braver in rooms where they once trembled. The person who practices truth-telling begins to see through lies more quickly. Habits refine perception. They shape emotion. They tune us to a different frequency of life. James never promised that this transformation would be quick. He did not offer shortcuts or tricks. What he offered was reality. The reality that identity is not discovered but built. That freedom is not a given but a practice. That greatness is not bestowed but earned through the patient chiseling of repetition. He invites us to think of our lives not as fixed stories, but as evolving manuscripts. Every day is an edit. Every act is a sentence revised. You may not have chosen your opening chapter, but you are always choosing what comes next. And what comes next depends on what you do now. Now is always the most powerful moment in James's vision, because now is always the site of habit. He points to the smallest possible acts as the site of transformation. Rising with your alarm, putting your phone down, listening fully, saying thank you, returning the shopping cart. Each of these is a vote for the person you wish to become. Each one, repeated, becomes easier. Each one, sustained, becomes reflex. And that reflex eventually becomes character. There is no character without habit. This is one of James's most radical claims, that virtue is not innate, that love is not natural, that wisdom is not spontaneous. They are practiced. They are cultivated. They are hard-won. And because they are hard-won, they are real. He also believed that failing to act was itself a habit. That procrastination, avoidance, distraction, these were not neutral pauses, but training in reverse. To delay, the good is to rehearse the bad. To postpone the difficult is to reinforce the easy. This is why he was so insistent on immediate action. Do it now, he said. Not perfectly, not completely, but do it. The nervous system responds to movement, not intention. This truth can be liberating or terrifying, because it means there is no excuse. But it also means there is always a way forward, always a new act, always a new groove to carve. The past is not a prison. It is a pattern, and patterns can be repatterned through attention, effort, and repetition. And so we end where we began, with the question of who you are becoming, not who you think you are, not who others say you are, but who your habits say you are, who your repeated actions are shaping you to be, James would not give you an answer. He would give you the question and ask you to live inside it. What are you repeating that you no longer wish to become? And if this question moved you, if this exploration into James's world of habits stirred something deeper, remember to like this video, subscribe for more philosophical journeys, and share it with 3 friends who are walking the same path of self-transformation. Each action is a ripple. Let yours begin now.